The Brooklyn Bridge
I'm
at 2 in the
coming,
morning
hold
in
on!
February is not a place for the living. It belongs to the wind, to the fog that crawls off the East River in heavy, suffocating layers that swallow the bridge lights whole and turn every surface into something slick and treacherous and uncertain. The kind of cold that settles in at that hour does not simply touch the skin. It enters through the lungs first, then works its way into the joints and the marrow and the deep interior spaces where warmth is supposed to be permanent, and it sets up there with the patience of something that has no intention of leaving. The bridge lights fight against all of it, but they fight the way a man fights exhaustion on the third day without sleep. Not winning, just persisting. Casting everything in a pale, sickly yellow glow that makes the bridge look like an old photograph of a bridge, something that once existed in full color, but had been drained of it so gradually that nobody noticed until there was nothing left. At that hour, the bridge belongs to the people who have no other options. The late shift workers crossing with their heads down and their hands shoved deep into pockets. The occasional taxi moving through the vehicle lanes like a thought nobody finished. And sometimes rarely the ones who climb the pedestrian walkway not to cross but to stand at the railing and have a conversation with the darkness below that nobody else is invited to hear. Marin Caldwell was none of those people. She was moving across the Brooklyn Bridge at 62 miles per hour on a 2019 Harley-Davidson Heritage Classic, a machine that weighed nearly 800 pounds with her on it and handled the bridge's expansion joints with the reluctant compliance of something designed for open highway, not for fog-blind urban crossings at 2 in the morning in the dead of winter. She was 17 years old. She had been riding since she was 14. She had rebuilt the transmission on this particular bike herself in the garage behind her father's shop in Newark, lying on her back on a creeper, with grease to her elbows, while Boone Thatcher stood over her and told her she was torquing the clutch basket wrong, and she told him she wasn't, and 3 hours later the transmission ran cleaner than it had in 2 years, and Boone never corrected her technique again. She was not supposed to be on this bridge tonight. She was not supposed to be anywhere tonight except the second-floor apartment above the shop on Ferry Street, where she had lived her entire life surrounded by the permanent smell of primer and engine oil and the low vibrations of the ironbound district, settling into its nightly stillness. Instead, she was crossing the Brooklyn Bridge with a USB drive pressed flat against her ribs inside the interior pocket of her riding jacket, a pocket she had sewn in herself 3 months ago for exactly this purpose. And the contents of that drive were worth more than the motorcycle beneath her and the bridge she was crossing, and possibly her life, though she was working very hard not to think about that last part. 3 months of work lived on that drive. 3 months of late-night meetings in places her father would never think to look for her. Diners in Red Hook, a storage facility in Long Island City, the back office of a marine supply shop in Port Morris, run by a woman named Collier, who owed Marin's father a debt large enough to guarantee discretion, but owed the truth a larger one. What Marin had assembled piece by piece, conversation by conversation, document by document, was a map. Not a physical one, a structural one. A blueprint of exactly how a faction operating under her father's name and wearing his patches had built a network across 4 states that moved money through municipal infrastructure contracts with the systematic precision of an organization that had been doing it long enough to stop worrying about getting caught. Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Maryland, 4 states, 11 cities, a web of fraudulent contracts awarded to shell companies that traced back through layers of deliberate obfuscation to men who rode under the same banner her father had built from nothing in a garage in Newark 31 years ago. Her father did not know. That was the part that kept Marin awake at night, not the danger of what she was doing, though the danger was substantial and she understood it with the unblinking clarity of someone who had grown up in a world where consequences were physical and immediate and delivered without the courtesy of a warning. What kept her awake was the knowledge that Gunnar Caldwell, the man they called Iron Ridge, the man who had raised her alone since her mother died of pancreatic cancer when Marin was 6 years old, did not know that his name was being used to move money through rigged city contracts across 4 states. And she had not told him. Not because she didn't trust him. She trusted him more completely than she trusted the rotation of the earth. She had not told him because she did not yet know how deep the infection reached. She did not know which of the men at his table were clean and which had been turned, and until she knew that telling her father meant trusting every man he might tell, and that was a circle of trust too wide for the stakes involved. So she had been careful. She had been patient. She had moved through 3 months of investigation with the methodical discipline of someone who understood that a single misstep would not result in a setback or a delay, but in the permanent and irreversible kind of consequence that ends with a body in a place where bodies are not supposed to be found. Tonight had been the final meeting. Collier had handed her the last piece, a set of financial transfer records that connected the shell companies to a specific account that could be traced to a specific individual. And that individual was not a biker, not a contractor, not anyone in the obvious ecosystem of the organization. That individual held a federal position, a law enforcement position, the kind of position that explained how the operation had run undetected for so long, because the person responsible for detecting it was the person running it. Marin had the drive. She had the evidence. She had 3 months of accumulated intelligence that could dismantle the entire operation and clear her father's name in a single coordinated action. She was 11 minutes from Newark. She never made it. The headlights appeared behind her as she passed the first tower. High beams sudden close enough that the light filled her mirrors completely and turned the fog behind her into a white wall. An SUV, dark-colored, no front plate visible through the glare. Moving fast, moving with the deliberate acceleration of a vehicle not trying to pass but trying to close distance. Marin's hands tightened on the grips. She had grown up in a world where vehicles appearing behind you at 2 in the morning with their high beams on carried a specific and unambiguous meaning, and her body responded to that meaning before her conscious mind had finished translating it. She dropped her weight forward, opened the throttle, and the Harley surged beneath her with the deep mechanical authority of 800 pounds of American engineering responding to a direct command. The SUV matched her acceleration. It closed the gap from 4 car lengths to 2 in the space of a breath. The bridge lights streaked past in her peripheral vision. The fog ahead of her was a wall she was riding into, blind trusting the bridge to be there beneath her tires because she could not see it. The impact came from the left rear quarter, not a full collision. A calculated nudge, the kind of contact that looked accidental on camera, but was delivered with the precision of someone who had done it before and understood exactly how much force was needed to destabilize a motorcycle at speed on a surface slick with February condensation. The Harley's rear wheel broke traction first. The back end swung right in a motion that Marin felt in her spine before she felt it in her hands. And she knew in that instant, with the cold internal clarity that arrives when the body understands something, the mind is still processing, that she was going to lose the bike. The question was where and how and what she would hit when the geometry of the crash resolved itself into its final configuration. She fought it. 3 years of riding muscle memory fired simultaneously. Countersteer left, weight transfer, throttle management, every technique she had ever practiced in the parking lot behind the shop while Boone watched from the garage door with his arms crossed and said nothing because saying nothing was how Boone communicated approval. None of it was enough. The bridge surface was too slick. The impact had disrupted her center of gravity past the point of mechanical recovery. The Harley went sideways, then caught, then went sideways again harder, and the front wheel hit the bridge railing at an angle that compressed the forks and redirected 800 pounds of motorcycle directly into a section of guardrail that had already been weakened by age and weather and the accumulated fatigue of 100 years of holding the bridge together. The sound was enormous. Metal against metal at speed, amplified by the bridge structure, into something that echoed off the cables above and the water below, simultaneously, a sound that did not belong to the quiet catalog of noises the bridge produced at 2 in the morning and announced itself accordingly. Sudden violent wrong. The railing held, partially. The lower section buckled outward. The upper rail bent but did not break, and the Harley came to rest jammed at an acute angle against it, the front wheel over the edge spinning slowly in the open air above 130 feet of black frozen East River. The engine was still running. The exhaust pipe ticked against the bent metal in an irregular rhythm that sounded like a mechanical heartbeat winding down. Marin was pinned beneath the handlebars. Her left leg was trapped between the frame and the bent guardrail at an angle that sent a bright, clarifying bolt of pain through her entire body every time she tried to move. Her helmet was gone, torn free during the slide, and now somewhere behind her on the walkway or already falling toward the water below, no way to know. A gash above her left eye was painting the left side of her face red in steady, methodical lines. and the blood was reaching her mouth, and she could taste copper and winter and the unmistakable metallic flavor of a body working very hard to keep itself conscious. The SUV had stopped 60 yards back. Its lights were still on. For 3 seconds, that felt like 30 nothing happened. No door opened. No figure emerged. The vehicle sat in the fog with its engine running and its headlights cutting two bright tunnels through the mist, and Marin understood in those 3 seconds what the occupants were doing. They were watching. They were assessing. They were deciding whether the bridge and the river would finish what they had started or whether they needed to walk the remaining 60 yards and finish it themselves. Marin did not wait for their decision. She reached inside her jacket with her right hand, the one that still functioned without sending pain signals that turned her vision white at the edges, and she found the interior pocket. The USB drive was there. She pressed it deeper, zipped the pocket closed with fingers that were already losing fine motor control, and made a decision of her own. She would not let them take it. She would not let 3 months of work and the evidence that could save her father's name disappear into the East River or into the hands of men who had betrayed everything her father had built. If she went over the edge tonight, the drive went with her, and it would surface eventually because the truth has a way of surfacing even when it starts at the bottom of a river, but she was not planning to go over the edge. She gripped the railing with her left hand. The metal was cold enough to burn, and she felt the burn register somewhere far away in a part of her nervous system that had been deprioritized by the more urgent signals coming from her leg and her head, in the deep instinctive understanding that she was suspended above a fatal drop, and the only thing between her and that drop was a section of guardrail that was groaning under the weight of the motorcycle in a way that communicated its structural limits more clearly than any engineering report ever could. The SUV's lights went off. Then the engine went off. Then the vehicle reversed slowly, quietly, backing away into the fog until it was gone, swallowed by the mist as completely as if it had never been there at all. They had made their decision. The bridge would handle it. Marin held the railing and felt the motorcycle shift beneath her, felt the weight of it transferring incrementally toward the point of no return, inch by terrible inch. And she tightened her grip and stared up into the yellow bridge lights and the fog moving across them. And she thought with the strange specificity that only arrives at the edge of something final that she had never finished reading the book on her nightstand. A paperback about a woman who sailed alone across the Atlantic in 1927. She had gotten to page 212. She would never know how it ended. Her lips moved, nothing came out. Or something came out and the wind took it before it could become language. Her vision was narrowing at the edges, the peripheral world going dark while the center held on with diminishing returns, and she could feel her grip weakening in a way that was not dramatic or sudden but gradual and mechanical. The simple physics of a hand that had been gripping frozen metal for too long beginning to fail. She was still holding on when she heard the footsteps. Ezra Whitfield had not eaten in 2 days. This was not the crisis it would have been 7 months ago, when missing a meal still registered as emergency, when hunger was still a novelty sharp enough to produce panic. Now it was simply a fact filed alongside the other facts of his daily existence. His sneakers had a hole above the left toe. His jacket, a gray hoodie layered under a cracked vinyl windbreaker from a donation bin outside a church on Fulton Street, stopped functioning against the cold at approximately 28 degrees, and the current temperature was 19. His backpack held everything he owned in the world: a change of socks, a broken compass that had not pointed north in 3 months, and a sketchbook so worn at the spine that he held it together with a rubber band he had found on the sidewalk outside a post office in Flatbush. The compass was the only thing he owned that had a history. His mother had given it to him when he was 11, pressing it into his palm with both hands on a Tuesday afternoon in their narrow apartment on Homewood Avenue in Pittsburgh, telling him it had belonged to his father, a man she said had died before Ezra was born. She said it with the careful flatness of a sentence that had been rehearsed until the emotion had been sanded out of it, and even at 11, Ezra had heard the sanding. The compass had worked then. It stopped working 3 months into his time on the streets, the needle freezing in a position that pointed vaguely east regardless of which direction he faced, and he kept it anyway because it was the only physical proof that his father had existed as something other than an absence. He was 16 years old, and the city of New York did not know he existed. He had been heading for the Prospect Green Warming Shelter on DeKalb Avenue, a place that kept its doors open until 3 in the morning and on weeknights, and smelled permanently of industrial cleaner and other people's accumulated hardship, but was warm. And warm was the only metric that mattered on a night when the wind came off the river with the cutting authority of something that had traveled a long distance, with the specific intention of going through you rather than around you. He had 40 minutes to get there before capacity locked him out. He knew the walk. Cross the bridge, cut through the heights, down Flatbush, left on DeKalb. Simple mechanical, the kind of route that let the mind detach from the feet and go somewhere else entirely while the body handled the navigation. His mind was somewhere else entirely when the sound reached him. Not a crash, not exactly. Something underneath a crash, the way a note underneath a chord gives the chord its darkness. Metal under stress, metal being asked to hold more than it was designed to hold, and communicating its refusal in a low sustained groan that traveled through the bridge structure and entered Ezra's body through the soles of his feet before it reached his ears. He stopped walking. Every instinct he had spent 7 months building on the streets of Brooklyn fired at once. 7 months of sleeping in shelters and doorways and subway cars, and learning the hard way that the sounds that matter most are the ones that don't fit the pattern, the ones that interrupt the baseline hum of a city that runs on predictable noise, the way a river runs on gravity. He turned toward the sound before his brain had finished categorizing it. Through the mong 60 feet ahead, he saw the motorcycle. What was left of it? Jammed at a brutal angle against a section of bridge railing that was clearly failing, the front wheel hanging over the edge above 130 feet of frozen darkness, the machine groaning against the metal with the slow, terrible patience of weight being pulled by gravity toward its inevitable conclusion. And pinned beneath the handlebars, one hand on the railing, the other pressed against a wound above her left eye that was painting her face in dark, steady lines, was a girl. She was not much older than him, 17 maybe. Her helmet was gone. Her eyes were half open and moving with the unfocused quality of someone whose body was beginning to make decisions without consulting the mind, a systematic shutdown that started at the periphery and worked its way inward and would eventually reach the hand that was gripping the railing and make its decision there too. Ezra looked left, he looked right. A single vehicle had stopped 50 yards back, hazard lights, blinking in the fog like a slow mechanical pulse. Nobody was getting out. Nobody was running toward the railing. Nobody was doing anything except existing behind glass, warm and safe and paralyzed by the particular human calculation that tells a person someone else will handle it. Nobody else was going to handle it. He dropped his backpack. The sound it made hitting the walkway was small and insignificant, a soft impact that meant nothing to anyone except Ezra, who understood that he had just set down everything he owned in the world in a place he might not come back to, and he was doing it anyway because the math was simple and immediate and did not allow for the luxury of hesitation. He ran. The railing was cold enough to burn when he grabbed it. The burn was distant, filed in a category of sensation that his nervous system had deprioritized behind the more urgent information streaming in from every other channel. The height, the wind, the sound of the motorcycle shifting against the guardrail, the dark water 130 feet below, reflecting nothing, absorbing everything. He threw one leg over the railing, then the other. And suddenly there was nothing beneath his feet except the lowest rung of the guardrail, and the long vertical emptiness between the bridge and the river, and the wind hit him from 3 directions simultaneously, and his fingers went numb in the first 4 seconds, and he understood with complete clarity that he was now in a situation that could not be managed or negotiated or waited out. It could only be moved through. He pressed himself flat against the outside of the railing and moved toward her, hand over hand, the metal vibrating under his grip every time the motorcycle shifted its weight. The fog wrapped around both of them in a way that made the rest of the world disappear, reduced everything to a circle of yellow bridge light and cold metal, and 2 people and the sound of water moving far below in the darkness. She saw him when he was 4 feet away. Her eyes found his, and something moved through them. Not hope, because hope requires a clarity of mind she was running out of. Something more fundamental. Something that lived below hope in the architecture of a person's will. A decision made at the cellular level to hold on for 60 more seconds. He reached her, got one arm under hers, felt the full dead weight of her body, and the motorcycle pulling against him in a direction that led nowhere except down, and the pull was patient and constant, and felt like the river itself had decided she was coming and was simply waiting on the final details. He pulled. His sneakers had no grip on the frost-covered metal. His arms held no real strength, not the kind that comes from being fed and rested and physically built for moments of extreme exertion. He had not eaten in 2 days. He had not slept more than 4 hours in a stretch in 7 months. His body was a 16-year-old machine running on fumes and adrenaline and something deeper than either. He pulled from that deeper place. From whatever lives below muscle and bone in a region of the human architecture that most people never have to access because most people are never suspended on the outside of a bridge railing at 2 in the morning in February, trying to pull a stranger back from a 130-foot drop with nothing but their hands and their refusal to let go. She moved a fraction, then another fraction. The motorcycle groaned and tilted further, and for one suspended second, the entire weight of the machine transferred through her body into his arms, and he felt his fingers begin to slide on the railing, and he thought with a calm that had no business existing in that moment that this was how it ended. Two strangers on a bridge, the river below, the fog above. A Thursday in February that nobody would remember because there would be nobody left to remember it. It did not end. He found another half-inch of grip. His left foot caught a bolt in the railing's lower frame and the bolt held, and he planted against it and pulled one final time with everything that remained in him, every calorie, every reserve, every molecule of a body that had been running on empty for so long, it had forgotten what full felt like. They fell backward onto the walkway together. Ezra flat on his back. The girl collapsed across his chest, both of them breathing in the ragged, desperate rhythm of people who had just finished a negotiation with something they were not supposed to survive. Behind them, freed of her weight, the Harley tipped silently over the edge. The fall lasted long enough for Ezra to hear the wind moving around the machine as it dropped a sound like the bridge exhaling something it had been holding too long. Then the impact came up from below, a distant final percussion that echoed once off the bridge supports and then was swallowed entirely by the river. He lay there, staring up at the yellow bridge lights and the fog drifting across them in patterns that looked random but probably weren't. His hands were shaking. His left shoulder felt like something inside it had been rearranged into a configuration that was not original to the design. The cold was so complete he could not tell where his body ended and the night began. The girl was breathing beside him, slow, shallow, each breath a small negotiation between consciousness and its alternative. But breathing, present, alive in a way she had not been 30 seconds ago when the bridge had been making its decision and the river had been waiting below with its infinite patience. An MTA bus driver on the opposite side of the bridge had already called 911. Ezra could hear sirens beginning somewhere in the distance, that particular rising frequency. That means help is coming for someone, though in his experience it rarely meant help was coming for him. He sat up, looked at the girl. The blood was still moving down her face in thin, steady lines that followed the topography of her features, the way water follows the topography of land, finding the paths of least resistance, collecting in the spaces where bone met skin. He pulled the sleeve of his windbreaker over his hand and pressed it against the gash above her eye and held it there. She turned her face slightly toward the pressure. An involuntary movement, the body responding to care in its most basic form, warmth and pressure, and the presence of another person's hand before the mind had any say in the matter. Her lips moved. The first time the wind took whatever she said and carried it out over the river. The second time Ezra leaned closer, close enough to hear the breath behind the word, and she said it. One word, her last name, barely more than an exhale shaped by her lips into something recognizable. Caldwell. Every hair on the back of Ezra's neck stood up simultaneously. He knew that name. Not the way a person knows a name from a phone book or a news broadcast or the casual circulation of information through ordinary social channels. He knew it the way a person knows the name of a storm that has been on the horizon for as long as they can remember. The way anyone who had spent time in certain neighborhoods in Newark or Trenton or Philadelphia or Pittsburgh knew it. Not as a word, but as a signal, a boundary marker, a declaration of exactly what kind of man her father was and exactly what kind of world she came from, and exactly what happened to people who entered that world without an invitation. The sirens were closer now, red and blue light beginning to pulse somewhere at the Manhattan end of the bridge, distant but approaching, and Ezra felt the old calculation begin, the one that had kept him alive for 7 months, the rapid assessment of risk and exposure, in proximity to systems that did not exist to protect people who looked like him and lived the way he lived. But before he could move, her hand found his wrist. Not a grip exactly. Her fingers had no real strength left. It was more like a placement, a deliberate positioning of her hand on his arm that communicated something her voice could not yet manage at full volume. Her eyes opened wider, focused. For a moment, the unfocused quality was gone, replaced by something sharp and specific and entirely present. She looked directly at him with an intensity that did not belong to someone who had just been suspended above a fatal drop and was bleeding from a head wound on a bridge at 2 in the morning. She said 6 words, each one placed carefully spaced by the shallow breaths between them, delivered with the deliberate precision of someone who understood that she might only get one chance to say them and was not going to waste it. They are hunting me. Do not trust the police. Then her eyes lost their focus again, and her hand slipped from his wrist, and her head settled back against the walkway, and she was gone. Not dead, but gone in the way consciousness goes, when the body has reached the limit of what it can sustain and makes the executive decision to shut down the higher functions in order to preserve the essential ones. Ezra stared at her for 3 seconds. The sirens were very close now. The red and blue light was painting the fog in alternating colors that turned the entire bridge into something that looked like it belonged inside an emergency, which it did. He stood up. He picked up his backpack from where he had dropped it. He looked at the girl one more time, at the blood on her face and the rise and fall of her chest, and the 6 words she had given him that were still echoing inside his skull, with the deep resonance of information that changes the shape of everything around it. Then he turned and walked into the fog in the opposite direction of the sirens. His footsteps left faint impressions in the frost on the walkway, and by the time the first patrol car reached the damaged section of railing, those impressions were already fading in. The walkway held nothing but a girl, a bent guardrail, and the distant sound of a river that had received a motorcycle and returned nothing. The boy was already gone. 9 months before the bridge, Ezra had been a different kind of invisible. Not the invisibility of the streets where people look through you because you have been categorized and sorted and filed into a part of their awareness that requires no further attention. The invisibility of ordinary life. School routine, though, background rhythm of a neighborhood that did not make the evening news for anything good, but held its own particular dignity in the spaces between the difficult things. He and his mother, Lenora, had lived in a narrow apartment on Homewood Avenue in Pittsburgh's Homewood neighborhood, a place with a front window that faced a vacant lot and a back window that faced a neighbor's garden, and Lenora had always said the back window was the one worth having. She worked double shifts at UP, MC Presbyterian, 12 hours on her feet in the surgical recovery unit, coming home with the particular exhaustion of someone who spent their days caring for people in the worst moments of their lives, and then had to find enough left over to care for a 16-year-old boy who was growing faster than the grocery budget could keep pace with. She made enough, they managed. The apartment was small and the neighborhood was hard, and the future was the kind of thing they talked about in the conditional tense as something that would happen if certain other things happened first. But they had each other, and they had the back window, and they had Tuesday evenings when Lenora did not work, and they cooked together in the narrow kitchen, and the apartment smelled like garlic and possibility. On a Tuesday night in May, the possibility ended. Ezra had been cutting through the Strip District waterfront on his way back from a friend's place on Penn Avenue, a route he had taken a dozen times because it was faster than the bus, and he was 16 and time felt abundant in the way it only does before the world teaches you otherwise. The waterfront at that hour was usually empty. Loading docks locked up, the fish market, dark, the restaurants along Smallman Street closed and silent. He saw them meeting through a gap in the loading dock fencing. 5 men. 3 wore leather cuts with patches he recognized from a distance without being able to read them. Motorcycle club insignia. The kind of patches that communicated membership in a world that operated on rules the legal system did not write and could not enforce. A 4th man stood slightly apart from the bikers, wearing a dark jacket and carrying himself with a specific kind of institutional stillness that Ezra, even at 16, recognized as belonging to a category of professional. Not a biker, not a criminal in the traditional sense. Something else. Something that wore its authority the way a well-tailored jacket wears its structure, invisibly but shaping everything around it. The 5th man was handing something to one of the bikers. A sealed case passed with the brisk efficiency of a transaction that had been completed many times before and required no ceremony. Ezra should have kept walking. He understood that immediately afterward and every day since. But something about the man in the dark jacket held his attention. The face. Ezra drew faces. It was the thing he did better than anything else, the thing that lived in his hands and his memory with a precision that teachers had noticed and encouraged, and that he practiced constantly, filling his sketchbook with the faces of strangers on buses and in diners and on sidewalks, capturing them from memory after a single sustained look, because something about the architecture of a human face fascinated him in a way he had never been able to fully explain. He stood at the fence for 40 seconds, long enough to memorize the dark-jacketed man's features with the automatic precision of a practiced portraitist. The set of the jaw, the distance between the eyes, the particular way the man's hairline receded at the temples in a pattern that was as individual as a fingerprint. In those 40 seconds, the man turned and looked directly at the fence line, directly at the gap, directly at Ezra. Ezra walked away without running, because running would have been worse. He walked 4 blocks before his legs started shaking. 3 days later, 2 federal investigators knocked on Lenora's door. The case they described to her over 2 hours in the narrow living room with the back window in the neighbor's garden was layered and complex and involved multiple agencies and jurisdictions and terminology that Lenora had to ask them to repeat more than once. But reduced to its essence, to what it meant for her son and for their lives, it came down to a single fact. Ezra was the only eyewitness who could place a specific individual at a specific location at a specific time. And that individual was a federal contractor with security clearance, whose presence at that waterfront meeting made the entire prosecution structurally viable in a way it currently was not. Without Ezra's testimony, the case had circumstantial evidence and financial records, and the kind of paper trail that defense attorneys spent their careers teaching juries to doubt. With Ezra's testimony, the case had a human being who could look at the man in the dark jacket and say under oath that he was there. A witness protection arrangement was activated within 72 hours. It collapsed in 48. Ezra never knew exactly how the collapse happened. The mechanics of it remained hidden behind the institutional language of the agents who called Lenora to explain that the arrangement had been compromised and alternative measures were being evaluated. What Ezra knew was what happened 3 days after the collapse. Lenora was approached outside UPMA Presbyterian on a Wednesday evening by 2 men who did not identify themselves and did not need to. They communicated their message without words. The message was delivered through a fractured wrist and 3 cracked ribs, and a fear so total and so immediate that Lenora called Ezra from the hospital floor before she called for help, and the only thing she said was a single word: run. He ran north because north felt like distance, because the bus he caught without thinking was heading north, because at 16, when the floor of your life drops out and the only instruction you have been given is a single word from your mother's voice breaking apart on the other end of a phone call direction, is chosen by instinct rather than logic. And his instinct said away, and away happened to be north. Pittsburgh to Harrisburg, Harrisburg to Scranton, Scranton to the Port Authority bus terminal in Manhattan, where he stepped off a Greyhound at 6 in the morning into a city of 8 million people and understood for the first time what it meant to be completely and utterly alone. 7 months on the streets had taught him things that no classroom ever covered: how to sleep with his back against a wall and his backpack between his body and the wall so he could feel if anyone touched it; how to read a room in the first 3 seconds, identify the exits, assess the threats, file the information, and move accordingly; how to eat on less than $5 a day; how to become invisible, not as a metaphor, but as a practical skill, the ability to move through spaces without creating the kind of attention that led to questions, and questions led to systems, and systems led to databases, and databases led to the people who had already demonstrated what they did to the people connected to his name. He had not called his mother. He could not call his mother. The phone he had carried out of Pittsburgh was at the bottom of the Susquehanna River outside Harrisburg, dropped from a bridge on the second day because the investigators had told Lenora that phones were traceable, and traceable meant findable, and findable in the context of what had happened to the witness protection arrangement meant something worse than lost. He did not know if Lenora was still in the hospital. He did not know if she had recovered. He did not know if the two men had come back. He did not know anything about his mother's life since the phone call, and that not knowing was a weight he carried every day, alongside the backpack, in the broken compass, in the sketchbook full of strangers' faces. A weight that did not get lighter with time, but simply became more familiar. The way chronic pain becomes familiar, always present, eventually integrated into the baseline of existence, until you almost forget what it felt like to live without it. Almost. And now he was walking through the streets of Brooklyn at 2:30 in the morning with a damaged left shoulder and frost on his windbreaker, and 6 words echoing inside his head that he did not fully understand, but felt the truth of, with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had spent 7 months learning to trust the warnings that came without explanation. They are hunting me, Bakshi. Do not trust the police. He did not trust the police. That particular lesson had been taught and reinforced so thoroughly over the past 7 months that it no longer required conscious thought. It was simply part of the operating system, now embedded in the same layer of awareness that told him when to cross a street and when to avoid a subway car and when to leave a shelter before dawn, because staying too long in any one place was a pattern, and patterns were what hunters followed. He did not go to the Prospect Green shelter on DeKalb. The route there would take him back toward the bridge, back toward the sirens, back toward the red and blue lights that were now painting the fog above the East River in colors visible from a dozen blocks away. Instead, he turned east and walked toward Bushwick, adding 30 minutes to his night, but putting distance between himself and the scene of something that he understood instinctively would generate questions, and questions generated attention. And attention was the thing he had spent 7 months learning to avoid the way a hunted animal learns to avoid open ground. He reached the NYC Relief Collective on Myrtle Avenue at 2:51 in the morning. The overnight coordinator, a heavy-set woman named Gloria, looked up from her desk as he came in and said nothing, which was what he appreciated most about Gloria. She asked fewer questions than most. She kept a corner near the radiator, informally reserved for the regulars who needed it, and she operated on the principle that a person who showed up at 3 in the morning in February with blood on their sleeve and frost in their hair needed warmth more than they needed interrogation. He took the corner near the radiator. He pulled his jacket over his face. He wedged his backpack between his body and the wall, and he was asleep within 4 minutes, because the body, when it has been pushed far enough, does not wait for permission from the mind. It simply shuts down the non-essential functions and goes where it needs to go. He did not see the man sleeping 6 cots away. A broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s with close-cropped hair going gray at the temples, who had introduced himself as Pete 3 weeks ago and volunteered for the Tuesday food line and spoke to the other shelter residents with the casual, practiced friendliness of someone who had mastered the art of appearing to belong in places where he did not belong. Pete had been at the NYC Relief Collective for nearly as long as Ezra had. In Bellevue Hospital, 3 miles south, Marin Caldwell opened her eyes. The room was white and beige and smelled of antiseptic and institutional efficiency. A monitor beside the bed tracked her heart rate in green peaks and valleys. Her left leg was immobilized. The gash above her eye had been closed with 11 stitches that she could feel but could not see, a tight pulling sensation across her forehead that announced itself every time she moved her eyebrows. A nurse was adjusting something on the IV stand. A police officer was standing by the door, not guarding it exactly, but present in the way that police officers are present at hospitals when the patient arrived under circumstances that require a report. Marin assessed all of this in the first 6 seconds of consciousness. She had been trained not formally, not in any classroom or program, but by 17 years of living in a world where the first thing you did when you entered a room was understand the room. Who was in it, what they wanted, where the exits were, what the power dynamics looked like, and how they could be shifted. She asked the nurse for her jacket. The nurse hesitated. Marin asked again with the quiet authority of someone who was not making a request and understood the difference. The nurse brought the jacket. Marin reached inside it, found the interior pocket, felt the USB drive still there, and closed her eyes for a moment. That was not about relief, but about recalibration. The evidence was intact. The plan could continue. She asked the officer by the door to step into the hallway for 5 minutes. The officer looked at her with the expression of someone who was accustomed to making the decisions about when and where he stood. Marin looked back at him with an expression that was not hostile, not aggressive, Simply clear, the expression of a person who was going to get what she needed regardless of whether this particular obstacle cooperated or not. The officer stepped into the hallway. Marin picked up the room phone and dialed a number from memory. Not her father's charter phone, not the business line. The other number, the one that existed in her father's left inside pocket and was known to exactly 4 people on Earth, a number she had memorized at 13, because Gunnar had told her it was for emergencies and only emergencies, and she would know the difference when the time came. The time had come. The phone rang twice. Her father's voice came through the line, and she heard in the single word he used as a greeting, the particular quality of a man who had been awake for hours and was already operating inside a crisis that had begun when a different phone call told him his daughter was in a hospital. Marin spoke for 4 minutes. She did not waste a second of those 4 minutes on tears or reassurance or the emotional inventory that the moment might have licensed her to take. She was 17 years old and she was lying in a hospital bed with 11 stitches above her left eye and an immobilized leg, and she spoke to her father with a composed, strategic precision of a field commander delivering a situation report. She told him about the 3 months of investigation. She told him about the faction. She told him about the 4 states and the shell companies and the municipal contracts and the money moving through systems that wore his name without his knowledge. She told him about the USB drive and what it contained and who it could bring down. Then she told him what she needed him to do. Not revenge, not the ride of 220 men into Manhattan with the kind of intent that law enforcement had been preparing for since the first scanner caught the unusual radio traffic. She needed something more difficult than revenge. She needed discipline. She told her father to bring every rider to the Brooklyn Bridge, full colors, maximum visibility. And when they arrived at the section of railing where her motorcycle had gone over the edge, and a boy she did not know had pulled her back from 130 feet of darkness, she told him to fix it. Repair the guardrail, on camera, in front of every news helicopter and every phone and every journalist who would be watching. Gunnar was silent for a long moment. The silence of a man whose daughter had just described 3 months of secret investigation into a betrayal inside his own organization conducted without his knowledge, and was now giving him operational instructions from a hospital bed. He was not accustomed to receiving instructions. He had spent 31 years as the man who gave them. He asked why. One word. The same economy of language he had taught her by example her entire life. Marin answered with the strategic clarity that separated what she was asking from what anyone watching would expect. When 220 men in leather show up to repair a bridge at dawn, every camera in the city points at them. Every screen in the country shows their faces. And while every eye in America was watching the bridge, the men who had run her off that bridge could not move, could not act, could not disappear. Light was a weapon, and she was asking her father to flood the entire city with it. Gunnar was quiet for another moment. Then he said one word that Marin had heard him say perhaps a dozen times in her entire life, and never to anyone else. And the word carried a weight that went beyond its dictionary definition and into a space that only existed between the two of them. The word was yes. Then Marin said one more thing. She told him about the boy, the one who had pulled her from the railing with hands that were shaking and shoes that had no grip and a body that clearly had not been fed in days. The one who had looked at her with eyes that held something she recognized because she had grown up around men who carried hard things inside them and had learned to read what lived behind the surface of a person's expression. She told her father to find him. She described his eyes, his build, the windbreaker, and the backpack, and the particular quality of his stillness as he knelt beside her on the walkway in the moments before the sirens arrived. And she said something that made Gunnar pause in a way he had not paused during any other part of the conversation. That boy is running from something worse than what happened to me tonight. Find him before they do. She did not know who they were. She did not know what the boy was running from. She only knew what she had seen in his face in the 3 seconds before he disappeared into the fog, and what she had seen was a fear that did not belong to the moment on the bridge, a fear that predated the bridge, a fear that had been living inside him for a long time and had simply been illuminated briefly by the crisis they had shared before retreating again into the place where he kept it. Gunnar made 2 phone calls after he hung up with his daughter. The first was to Boone Thatcher. Within 20 minutes, 7 phones rang across 7 cities. Newark, Trenton, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Albany, Hartford, Providence. Each call lasted under a minute. Each recipient asked no questions. 220 men began pulling on leather and checking fuel gauges in the small hours of a Thursday morning. In February, moving with the quiet, purposeful efficiency of people responding to a signal they had always known might come. The second call was shorter. It went to a number that Boone answered on the first ring, and the instruction it contained was separate from the convoy, separate from the bridge, separate from the public spectacle that was about to unfold across every screen in the northeastern United States. The instruction was personal and specific, and concerned a boy on the streets of Brooklyn who did not know he was being looked for. By 4 in the morning, the first signs reached the outside world. Police scanners caught unusual radio traffic near the New Jersey approaches. A journalist named Nadia Prescott, working a routine overnight shift at a news station in Manhattan, caught the edge of the movement on a scanner she monitored out of professional habit and posted a cautious 2-sentence alert. She was not sure what she was looking at. She was sure enough to flag it. By 4:15, the post had been shared 1,100 times. By 4:30, the NYPD's Joint Operations Center had opened an active threat assessment file. The FBI's Newark field office had a duty agent making calls he was not fully authorized to make at that hour, but was making anyway because being the person who did not make them was worse than being the person who overstepped. The city was waking up to something it could not name. That particular quality of collective unease, the one that precedes understanding, spread through Brooklyn and lower Manhattan, the way cold enters a room when a window is open. People felt it before they knew what it was. Residents looked out windows at empty streets and felt it. Business owners near the bridge who caught the news alerts felt it. The overnight staff at Brooklyn's 84th Precinct felt it in the specific way law enforcement feels approaching events as a tightening, a sharpening, a collective leaning forward into the unknown. 3 news helicopters were airborne by 5 in the morning, circling wide holding patterns over the harbor. Their cameras pointed at the bridge approaches, their anchors filling dead air with careful speculation and the particular verbal construction that journalism uses when it knows something is coming but does not yet know what. In a hospital bed at Bellevue, Marin Caldwell lay still with the USB drive in her hand and her eyes open and her mind already 3 moves ahead. The bridge was the first move. Finding the boy was the second. The third was the one that nobody, not her father, not the FBI, not the men who had run her off the bridge, was going to see coming until it was already too late to stop. She was 17 years old and she was running the board from a hospital room, and outside the window somewhere across the dark water of the East River, 220 motorcycles were moving through the night toward a bridge that the whole country was about to watch. The sound arrived before the image did. It came from across the water first, traveling through the cold morning air above the harbor in a frequency that was felt in the chest before it was processed by the ear. A low, sustained vibration that did not belong to the ordinary acoustic catalog of a Brooklyn morning in February. Not traffic, not construction, not the mechanical hum of a city waking up and beginning its daily negotiation with itself. Something underneath all of that. Something older and more deliberate that spoke directly to the part of the human nervous system that has been listening for approaching things since before language existed. People on the Brooklyn waterfront turned toward it instinctively. Dog walkers who had ventured out in the gray pre-dawn light. A jogger on the Esplanade in Brooklyn Heights who stopped mid-stride and stood still with her breath forming small clouds in front of her face. 3 men at a coffee cart near the Fulton Ferry Landing who set down their cups simultaneously without looking at each other, drawn by the same invisible signal toward the same invisible source. Then the image came through the fog. 220 motorcycles in perfect formation crossing the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, 6 columns wide, moving with a synchronized discipline that looked less like a motorcycle convoy and more like something that had been choreographed, each rider holding exact position relative to the riders on either side, with the precision of instruments in an orchestra where every note had been scored and rehearsed and committed to the kind of muscle memory that does not require thought to execute. The bridge lights caught the chrome first. Then the headlights emerged from the monk in a long, unbroken line that materialized out of the gray like something arriving from another world. The death head patches on 220 leather cuts caught the pale morning light and held it. The exhaust breath of 220 engines rose into the cold air in a single continuous cloud that drifted east over the harbor like a weather system with its own intentions. News helicopters repositioned simultaneously. Three of them circling in wide holding patterns since 5 in the morning, their cameras now locked on the formation and transmitting waves live to networks that had interrupted regular morning programming without a second of hesitation. A producer at a midtown studio later said it was the simplest decision she had made in 11 years of live television. You do not cut away from 220 motorcycles riding in formation through Brooklyn at dawn. You clear the desk. You watch. You let the image speak for itself because there is no commentary adequate to compete with it. The convoy moved through Bay Ridge without stopping. Through Sunset Park, through Carroll Gardens, through Dumbo. The streets had been cleared by a combination of the early hour and the particular human instinct that empties a path for something it does not fully understand but recognizes as requiring space. Store owners who had arrived early to open stood in their doorways with their keys in their hands and watched the formation pass and did not move until the sound had faded enough to allow the ordinary morning to resume, which took longer than any of them expected. NYPD units shadowed the convoy at a careful distance, close enough to maintain visual contact, far enough to honor the forward instruction that had come down through federal channels at 4:17 that morning, an instruction so unexpected that the deputy commissioner had asked for it to be repeated twice before he accepted it as genuine. Do not engage them. The instruction had originated from the FBI's Newark field office. It had traveled through 3 levels of interagency communication in under an hour, which was itself unusual enough to generate its own kind of alarm. But it was the reason attached to the instruction delivered verbally and never committed to writing that had turned the deputy commissioner's office completely silent for 11 seconds and sent 3 senior investigators reaching for files they had believed were sealed. The reason had nothing to do with the convoy. It had everything to do with the boy who had disappeared from the bridge 7 hours earlier. A boy whose face had been captured by traffic cameras and whose identity, once it surfaced through the databases those cameras fed, connected to a case file that existed at a classification level the deputy commissioner did not have routine access to, and the existence of that file at that classification level meant that whatever was happening on the Brooklyn Bridge this morning was not the simple gang demonstration that every initial assessment had assumed. The convoy reached the Brooklyn Bridge at 6:09 in the morning. The fog had begun to thin, not enough to call it clearing, but enough that the bridge towers were visible for the first time since midnight, rising out of the gray like the bones of something ancient and permanent. The cables caught the first suggestion of sunrise, a pale band of light at the eastern horizon that did not warm anything but changed the quality of the cold from black to gray, from the cold of night to the cold of a winter morning that was at least acknowledging the existence of a day to come. The crowd on the Brooklyn waterfront had grown beyond what the NYPD officers managing the perimeter had prepared for. Several hundred people lined the esplanade. More were arriving on foot from the surrounding blocks, moving with the quiet urgency of people drawn by something they could feel but had not yet seen. Some carried phones held high. Some simply stood and watched with the stillness of witnesses who understood, at a level below articulation, that they were present for something that would be referenced and discussed and replayed long after the morning was over. A woman in a gray coat stood at the railing of the esplanade, with her hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. She had come down from her apartment on Columbia Heights when the sound of the engines woke her, and she had not been able to leave. She would later tell a reporter that it was not the motorcycles that held her there. It was the discipline, the silence between the machines, the way 220 men moved as a single body across a bridge she crossed every day, transforming something ordinary into something she would never see the same way again. The formation slowed as it approached the section of bridge where the guardrail still bore the physical evidence of what had happened 7 hours earlier. Bent metal, scrape marks in the paint that traced the geometry of a motorcycle's final trajectory, a dark stain in the frost that anyone who looked directly at understood immediately without requiring explanation. The lead motorcycle stopped at that exact point. The ones behind it stopped in sequence, a wave of deceleration moving backward through the formation with mechanical precision until all 220 engines died within 4 seconds of each other. The silence that followed was enormous. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something else, something that occupied the space where sound had been and filled it with a weight that pressed against the eardrums, in the chest, in the particular part of the mind that processes scale. A journalist broadcasting live from the South approach used the word catastrophic to describe it and then paused and considered retracting it and then decided it was the only accurate word available. Catastrophic silence. The kind that arrives when something massive stops and the world has not yet adjusted to what replaces it. The crowd that had gathered along both bridge approaches, several hundred people deep by now, held that silence the way a congregation holds a moment of prayer. Not because anyone had instructed them to, because the silence demanded it. Because 220 men sitting motionless on motorcycles on a bridge in the early morning light of a Brooklyn February communicated something that bypassed language entirely and went directly to the part of the human experience that understands ceremony without needing it explained. Gunnar Caldwell dismounted alone. He handed nothing to anyone. He said nothing to anyone. He simply swung his right leg over the seat with the unhurried movement of a man who was entirely alone with his purpose, and he walked to the damaged guardrail and he stopped in front of it. He was 51 years old, built through the chest and shoulders, with the physical density of a man who had been tested repeatedly by the world and had repeatedly declined to break. The scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his jaw was old enough to have stopped telling its own story and had simply become part of his face, the way a river becomes part of a landscape, not an addition, but an integration, something that had always been there even though it hadn't. He looked at the bent metal for a long moment. Then he reached out and placed both palms flat against it, against the exact section that had held the weight of his daughter and the weight of a boy he did not know, while 130 feet of frozen darkness waited below. He bowed his head, 220 men behind him. Not one moved, not one spoke. The helicopters held their altitude. The cameras kept recording. The crowd on the bridge approaches did not make a sound. He stayed that way for 90 seconds. It was the most watched 90 seconds of silence in New York that year. When he lifted his head and straightened his back, something in the quality of the morning shifted. A subtle change, like the moment between the end of a held breath and the beginning of the next one. He turned to face his men. He looked at them with the expression of a man looking at something he trusted completely and had trusted for decades and was about to trust with one more thing. Then he gave a single nod. What happened next dismantled every assumption that every person watching had constructed over the previous 6 hours. Toolboxes came off, saddlebags. Not weapons, not anything that confirmed the threat assessment law enforcement had been running since 4 in the morning. Toolboxes, work gloves snapped onto hands that had been clenched during the entire ride across 3 boroughs. Welding equipment emerged from 3 modified cargo vans that had been trailing the convoy and that nobody in the media coverage had paid sufficient attention to because cargo vans are not cinematic and motorcycles are. Steel plating, industrial cleaning supplies. Replacement guardrail components that had been measured and cut before dawn in a shop in Newark, before the convoy ever left, by men who understood metalwork the way they understood their own hands, intimately, precisely, with the accumulated knowledge of decades spent shaping steel into things that held. 220 members of the organization went to work on the Brooklyn Bridge. The silence broke then, but not the way anyone had anticipated. It broke into the sound of tools and metal and men working with the focused efficiency of a crew that had planned this operation down to the component level. Welders struck arcs, grinders smoothed edges. A section of damaged railing was cut away and replaced with new steel that had been primer-coated in the hours before the ride. Hands that the public associated with a particular kind of violence moved with the careful practiced precision of hands that had been building things their entire lives, which most of them had because the men who rode under Gunnar Caldwell's banner had come to him from machine shops and welding yards and construction sites in the particular blue-collar infrastructure of the American Northeast that builds things that last and takes professional pride in the building. A repair job that the New York City Department of Transportation had logged that morning as a 3-week contracted project requiring lane closures, safety scaffolding, environmental review, union labor coordination, and the full procedural machinery of municipal infrastructure maintenance was being completed by men in leather cuts who moved with the organizational efficiency of a crew that had been assembling things under pressure for longer than most of the watching journalists had been alive. The live broadcast anchors stopped speaking for nearly 30 seconds. One of them, a veteran reporter named Curtis Aldine, who had covered New York for 22 years, said simply on air that he had covered this city for 2 decades and had no template for what he was watching. The line was clipped and replayed thousands of times before the morning was over. The footage hit every platform simultaneously. The comment sections filled faster than the moderation algorithms could process. People across the country watched 220 men repair a bridge in the pale light of a Brooklyn winter morning and felt something shift inside their understanding of a word they thought they already knew the definition of. The word was loyalty, but not everyone watching felt the warmth of it. In the press area established by the NYPD, on the south approach of the bridge, Nadia Prescott was not watching the repair. She was sitting in her station's mobile unit with her laptop open and a security footage file running on her screen that the NYPD Public Information Office had released to credentialed media 2 hours earlier as part of standard incident documentation. Nadia had been a journalist for 9 years. 6 of those years had been spent covering federal crime cases before she moved to general assignment, and in those 6 years she had developed a particular set of habits that most of her colleagues considered excessive and she considered essential. Cross-referencing was one of them. When a piece of footage crossed her desk that contained an unidentified individual involved in an unusual event, she ran it through every publicly accessible database available to a credentialed journalist with the appropriate access tier. Not because she expected results, because the 1 time in 50 that a result came back made the other 49 times worth the effort. This was the 1 time in 50. The facial recognition query she had submitted to a federal missing persons database 11 minutes ago had returned a match. She had been staring at it since reading it, rereading it, making sure she understood the implications of what she was looking at before she did anything with it. The boy in the bridge footage, the one who had pulled the girl from the railing and disappeared into the fog before any officer reached the scene. The one the morning shows were already calling a mystery hero, building the narrative of a nameless, homeless teenager who had done something extraordinary and vanished. The match had not come back to a missing child report, not to a runaway alert, not to anything that fit the story the rest of the media was already constructing. The match was flagged at federal level. Restricted access, partial visibility before the file locked behind a classification wall that Nadia's credentials could not penetrate. But she had seen enough in the fraction of a second before the lock engaged. A case number, a district court designation, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, active investigation, witness status. The boy was not a random homeless teenager who happened to be on a bridge at 2 in the morning. The boy was a federal witness in an active case, and he was on the streets of New York instead of in a protection program, and the distance between those two facts contained a story that was orders of magnitude larger than the one currently playing on every screen in America. Nadia reached for her phone and then stopped. In the reflection of her laptop screen, she saw something in the window of the mobile unit behind her, a man standing outside not looking at the bridge, not looking at the convoy, not looking at any of the things that every other person within a mile radius was looking at. He was looking at her screen. He had been there long enough to have seen exactly what she was reading, and when their eyes met in the reflection, he did not look away. He smiled. The kind of smile that communicates not warmth, but awareness. The smile of a person who wants you to know they have seen what you have seen. By the time Nadia turned around, the space outside the window was empty. The man was gone with the completeness of someone who had never intended to be seen in the first place and whose only mistake was being seen anyway. The cold morning air held no trace of him, just the sound of tools on metal drifting down from the bridge and the cold residue on Nadia's nervous system of something that she could not name but felt with absolute certainty. She sat very still for a moment, then she closed the database query. She sat still for a moment, processing not the information itself, but the weight of the decision the information required. She had been in journalism long enough to understand that certain discoveries carried an obligation that went beyond the professional. The boy's identity broadcast to the public would reach the same screens as the bridge footage. And if the boy was a federal witness who had ended up on the streets instead of in protection, there was a reason for that, and the reason likely involved people who were still looking for him and Broadcasting his face and his name would do their work for them. Nadia made a decision. She would not publish. Not yet. Not until she understood the full architecture of what she had found. She closed her laptop and reached for her phone, and she made a call not to her editor, but to a contact she had maintained since her years covering federal cases. A contact inside the FBI's Newark field office, whose name she protected with the same care she protected her sources. The contact confirmed enough. Not everything. Enough to tell Nadia that the boy's situation was exactly as dangerous as the database flag had implied, and that the system that should have been protecting him had failed in a way that was not accidental. Nadia made a second call. This one went through a chain of intermediaries that took 40 minutes to resolve, and when it finally connected, the voice on the other end belonged to a 17-year-old girl in a hospital bed at Bellevue who answered the phone with a calm that did not match her circumstances and asked Nadia 3 questions in rapid succession that told Nadia immediately that this girl was not what the morning coverage had made her out to be. Marin Caldwell was not a victim. She was an operator, and she was already several steps ahead of everyone in the room. Marin listened to what Nadia had found. She listened with the focused silence of someone absorbing information that confirmed a suspicion she had not yet been able to articulate, but had felt forming since the moment on the bridge when a boy with shaking hands and no grip on his shoes had pulled her back from a 130-foot drop and then run from the police with the practiced speed of someone for whom the police were not a source of safety, but a source of danger. "They are hunting me. Do not trust the police." Marin had said those words to Ezra on the bridge, talking about herself, about the men in the SUV who had run her off the road. But the boy had heard them and responded not with confusion, but with recognition. He had understood them immediately because they described his own situation as accurately as they described hers. Now she knew why. The boy was a witness. The system meant to protect him had been compromised from the inside. Someone with access to his protection arrangement had sold his location, and that someone was still operational, still inside the system, still hunting. Marin did not ask Nadia to run the story. She asked Nadia to hold it, to sit on the most significant piece of journalism, to cross her desk in years, to resist every professional instinct and every competitive pressure, and wait. Nadia asked what she was waiting for. Marin told her she was waiting for the right moment, and when it came, Nadia would have everything. Exclusive, complete, on the record. Nadia agreed, not because she trusted Marin. She did not know Marin well enough to trust her, but because she trusted the architecture of what Marin was building. She could hear it in the girl's voice, the structural logic of a plan being assembled in real time by someone who understood how the pieces fit together and was placing them with a patience that did not match her age. Then Marin made the call that mattered most. Agent Delafontaine had been with the FBI's Newark field office for 14 years. She had run cases involving organized crime, public corruption, and the particular intersection of the two that occurs when criminal organizations embed themselves deeply enough into municipal systems that removing them requires surgery rather than force. She was 46 years old, methodical, precise, and carried the permanent expression of someone who had learned that patience was not a virtue in her line of work, but a tactical necessity. She had been monitoring the Brooklyn Bridge situation since 4:30 that morning. She had read the classified file on the boy. She knew things about the case that Nadia Prescott's database query had only hinted at. She knew the name of the federal contractor at the center of the Pittsburgh prosecution. She knew about the compromised protection arrangement, and she knew with the particular frustrated certainty of an investigator who has been watching a case stall for months that the corruption extended into law enforcement itself, into the U.S. Marshal Service, into the specific office responsible for protecting the witnesses whose testimony could bring the entire network down. What she did not know was who. 14 months of investigation had not produced the name of the person inside the marshal's office who was selling witness locations to the subjects of active prosecutions. The evidence pointed to the Pittsburgh field office. The evidence suggested a deputy marshal with sufficient access to witness relocation records. The evidence narrowed the field to fewer than a dozen candidates. But evidence and proof are separated by a gap that has ended more careers than it has advanced, and Delafontaine had not yet found the bridge across it. Then Marin Caldwell called her. Marin did not introduce herself with her name. She introduced herself with information. She described the USB drive in her possession and what it contained. She described 3 months of investigation into a faction operating under her father's banner across 4 states. She described financial transfer records connecting shell companies to a specific account held by a federal employee. Della listened in the focused silence of an investigator hearing things she has been trying to hear for over a year from a source she never anticipated. Then Marin made her offer. It was not a negotiation. It was an exchange stated clearly and without condition. The USB drive and everything on it in return for one thing. Real protection for the boy on the bridge, properly structured, personally overseen by Della, with direct accountability to the U.S. Attorney's Office, and no involvement from the Marshal's Office in Pittsburgh or any other office that had demonstrated it could not be trusted with the safety of a 16-year-old witness. Della asked how Marin knew about the boy. Marin told her. Della asked how Marin had obtained the information about the compromised protection arrangement. Marin told her that too, and then Della asked the question she had been holding since the beginning of the call, the question that the entire conversation had been building toward. Marin told her about the man in the dark jacket, the federal contractor whose presence at the Pittsburgh waterfront meeting was the linchpin of the prosecution. And she told Della something that Della's 14 months of investigation had not yet uncovered. The contractor was not operating alone within the federal system. He had a handler, a deputy marshal in the Pittsburgh field office named Corbin Stroud, who had been selling witness locations for 14 months through a communication channel that Marin's investigation had documented from the other end, from the recipients of that information, the men in her father's organization who had been paying for it. Della Fontaine sat at her desk in the Newark field office and did not move for 12 seconds. Then she asked Marin one question. Where is the boy now? Marin told her she was working on it. In the warming shelter on Myrtle Avenue in Bushwick, Ezra was asleep in the corner near the radiator, with his jacket over his face and his backpack between his body and the wall. The shelter held its usual population of bodies in various states of exhaustion, the room carrying its permanent atmosphere of damp clothing and industrial soap, and the accumulated weight of lives being lived at the margin. Something woke him. Not a sound, not a touch. The specific quality of the air in a room, changing the way it changes when focused attention enters a space and settles on a particular point. 7 months of street survival had built this sensitivity into the base of his nervous system, a detection system that operated below conscious thought and registered changes in his environment, the way a seismograph registers changes in the earth before the event has a name, before the rational mind has time to construct a category for it. He was already sitting up and pulling the jacket from his face before he understood why. Boone Thatcher was sitting across from him. He had pulled a chair from the nearest table and positioned it 3 feet from Ezra's corner and sat in it with the patient, unhurried stillness of a man who was comfortable waiting and had been doing exactly that for long enough to be certain of what he was looking at before the person he was looking at became aware of being looked at. He was a large man, broad through the chest and shoulders with the physical dimensions of someone who had spent decades doing work that built the body from the outside in. His face had the particular quality of a landscape that had been rearranged by weather and time and had settled into a configuration that communicated a great deal without expressing much. He wore no club insignia tonight, just a dark jacket and work boots and the unmistakable quality of someone who did not require visible symbols to communicate what he was. Ezra recognized him anyway. Not his face specifically, but his category, the way he sat, the way the space around him seemed to reorganize itself to accommodate his presence, the way the other shelter residents had unconsciously adjusted their positions to create a margin of empty space around his chair that nobody had asked for and nobody had decided to create, but that existed nonetheless with the reliability of a physical law. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The shelter's ambient noise continued around them. The hum of the radiator, the breathing of sleeping bodies, the distant sound of a television playing somewhere near the front desk where Gloria sat with her crossword puzzle and her policy of strategic inattention. Then Boone reached into his jacket, slowly, with 2 fingers. The deliberate gesture of a man being careful to be readable, to move in a way that communicated its intentions before completing its action. He placed a phone on the floor between them, screen facing up, a video call already connected and waiting. Ezra looked at the screen. Gunnar Caldwell looked back at him. The older man's face held nothing that could be categorized as warm or hostile. It was the face of a man in the process of understanding something, a face engaged in the work of assessment, measuring what it saw against what it needed to see before arriving at a conclusion. Then Boone reached into his other pocket and placed two photographs on the floor beside the phone. The first was a surveillance image. Grainy timestamp taken at an angle that suggested a security camera mounted high on a building across from the Strip District waterfront in Pittsburgh. It showed the loading dock, the men in leather cuts, the sealed case changing hands. And the man in the dark jacket, his face turned slightly toward the fence line, toward the gap in the fencing, toward the exact point where a 16-year-old boy had stood for 40 seconds too long on a Tuesday night in May. Ezra's jaw tightened when he saw it. The image was a mirror held up to the moment his life had split into, before and after, and seeing it reproduced in a photograph time-stamped and documented and held in the hand of a stranger in a Brooklyn shelter meant that other people had been watching that night too. Other people had seen what he had seen. And those other people had been carrying that knowledge through channels he had not known existed. Then Boone placed the second photograph beside the first. This one was clear, recent, taken inside a building Ezra recognized immediately because he was sitting in it. The NYC Relief Collective on Myrtle Avenue. The photograph showed a man standing at the volunteer registration desk near the shelter entrance. Broad-shouldered, mid-40s, close-cropped gray hair at the temples, a shelter badge visible on his chest that read Pete Community Outreach in clean printed letters. The timestamp in the lower corner of the photograph read 11 days ago. Ezra stared at the two photographs side by side on the floor of the shelter. The surveillance image from Pittsburgh, the photograph from this room. Two images separated by 9 months in 500 miles that were now lying next to each other on a linoleum floor in Bushwick, and the distance between them was closing with the speed and inevitability of a door swinging shut. Boone spoke for the first time. His voice was low, unhurried, and carried the particular weight of information delivered by someone who understood exactly what it would cost the person receiving it. He said that the man who called himself Pete was Deputy Marshal Corbin Stroud, Pittsburgh Field Office. That Stroud had arrived at the NYC Relief Collective 3 days after Ezra had. That his volunteer registration, his Tuesday food line shifts his casual conversations with the other residents. His entire presence in the shelter was a construction built with the professional skill of someone who was trained to build exactly these kinds of constructions and who had been using that training for 14 months to locate and compromise federal witnesses. Ezra's eyes moved across the shelter floor toward the entrance. His body had already begun the calculation, the exits, the distances, the number of bodies between him and the door, the same rapid threat assessment that 7 months of survival had made as automatic as breathing. The man who called himself Pete was standing in the doorway. He was looking directly at Ezra. His right hand was already moving toward the inside of his jacket with the slow, calculated motion of a man making a decision about how the next 30 seconds were going to unfold. His face held the focused, analytical expression of someone running a rapid operational assessment. Distance to target, obstacles between, time before variables shifted, risk of witnesses. The mathematics of violence conducted in real time behind eyes that had performed these calculations before and had always arrived at the same answer. Nobody in the shelter moved, not because they did not sense the change. People who live at the margins develop a sensitivity to danger that operates below conscious awareness, a peripheral detection system calibrated by years of proximity to situations where the distance between safety and its opposite could collapse without warning. They felt the shift in the room. Conversations dropped to nothing. Eyes went to plates. Bodies angled away from the doorway with the practiced, unconscious geometry of self-preservation. Stroud's hand stayed where it was, inside his jacket, not drawing, not retreating, suspended in the space between action and its consequences, waiting for the calculation to complete. He had not calculated Boone. Boone did not stand up quickly. He did not reach for anything. He did not alter his posture or his breathing or the angle of his shoulders in any way that registered as sudden movement. He simply turned his head toward the doorway and looked at Stroud with an expression so completely empty of alarm that it functioned as its own form of communication. The communication of a man who had been in rooms worse than this one with men more dangerous than this one, and had always been the person who walked out of those rooms under his own power. He held that look for 3 seconds. 3 seconds that contained an entire conversation conducted in a language that required no words and was understood fluently by both participants. Then Boone reached into his jacket with two deliberate fingers and placed his own phone on the floor beside the first one. Screen up, showing a live call with a single name displayed at the top. The name was not Gunnar Caldwell. The name was Marin Caldwell. Stroud read it from the doorway. 20 feet of shelter floor between him and the phone, but the screen was bright enough and the name was clear enough and the implications were immediate and total. The girl from the bridge was alive and awake and listening to everything happening in this room in real time. And the girl from the bridge was the daughter of a man who commanded the loyalty of 220 men who were at this moment standing on the Brooklyn Bridge in front of every camera in America. And if anything happened in this shelter in the next 10 seconds, the entire weight of that organization would come down on the person responsible with a speed and a certainty that no amount of federal credentials could deflect. But it was more than that. Stroud was a man who understood power structures. He had spent 14 months operating inside one, exploiting its vulnerabilities, selling its secrets. He understood that a name on a screen was not just a name, it was a signal. It meant that the girl knew who he was. It meant that the girl had connected the dots between Pittsburgh and Brooklyn, between a compromised witness protection arrangement and a volunteer at a warming shelter named Pete. And if the girl knew, then the question of who else knew became the only question that mattered. His hand came out of his jacket, empty. He stood in the doorway for another moment, the particular stillness of a man absorbing a recalculation. The mathematics of the situation had changed completely in the space of 3 seconds, and the new equation did not resolve in his favor, and he was experienced enough to recognize that immediately and disciplined enough to act on the recognition without the delay of ego or pride or the stubborn refusal to accept an altered reality that gets men killed in situations exactly like this one. He turned and walked out of the shelter without a word, without rushing. The door closed behind him with a sound so ordinary, so mundane that it seemed to belong to a different narrative entirely. A door closing on a Thursday evening at a warming shelter in Bushwick. The most unremarkable sound in the world. The silence it left behind was not unremarkable. Ezra released a breath he had been holding since the moment he saw Stroud's hand move toward his jacket. The breath came out in a single long exhalation that carried with it a tension so deep and so sustained that releasing it felt like setting down a physical weight he had been carrying in his chest for 9 months. From the phone on the floor, Marin's voice came through the speaker. Not loud, not dramatic, just present, clear and steady and entirely in control. She asked Ezra if he was all right. 2 words that in another context from another person would have been a formality, a social script performed out of obligation. From her in this moment, spoken through a phone on a shelter floor, to a boy she had met once on a bridge while bleeding from a head wound and pinned under a motorcycle. The words carried a weight that had nothing to do with their dictionary definitions and everything to do with the fact that she had orchestrated the entire sequence from a hospital bed 3 miles away with 11 stitches above her left eye and an immobilized leg and the calm structural intelligence of someone who had spent 3 months learning how to see several moves ahead and was now operating at a level that neither the FBI nor the men hunting Ezra had anticipated. Boone picked up both phones. He placed the photographs back in his jacket pocket. He looked at Ezra with an expression that communicated a single simple piece of information. You are coming with me. Ezra looked at the corner near the radiator where he had been sleeping. At the backpack wedged against the wall. At the space he had occupied for 3 weeks, in a room full of people whose names he had never asked and who had never asked his a temporary arrangement in a life that had been nothing but temporary arrangements for 7 months. He picked up his backpack. He put it on. He followed Boone Thatcher out of the shelter and into the cold Brooklyn night. Behind them, the shelter settled back into its baseline rhythms with the settled resilience of a place accustomed to disruption. Gloria looked up from her crossword, looked at the empty corner near the radiator, looked at the closed door, and made a note in her intake log that would never be read by anyone and would never need to be. Outside, a car was waiting. Not the kind of car Ezra associated with the world Boone inhabited. Not a motorcycle, not a van with blacked out windows, not anything that matched the visual vocabulary of the threat he had spent 7 months running from. A sedan. Clean, unremarkable, the kind of vehicle designed to be forgotten immediately after it passes through your field of vision. Boone opened the rear door. Ezra got in. The interior was warm, and the warmth hit him with a force that was almost violent after hours in a shelter that never quite reached comfortable, and months of sleeping in spaces where warmth was a commodity that arrived in small, unreliable portions. Boone got in the front passenger seat. A driver Ezra had not noticed until now, a man whose face held the professional blankness of someone trained to be present without being perceived, put the car in gear and pulled away from the curb. As the shelter receded in the rear window, Ezra allowed himself to consider something he had not considered in 9 months. The possibility that he was moving towards safety rather than away from danger. The distinction was subtle but vast. Away from danger was reactive, a perpetual retreat, a life defined by the thing it was running from. Towards safety was something else entirely. It was a direction, it had a destination, it implied that somewhere ahead of him, someone had built a place where the running could stop. 3 miles south in a hospital room at Bellevue, Marin Caldwell set down the phone and closed her eyes. Not to sleep, to think. The bridge had drawn every camera. Boone had secured the boy. Stroud had been identified and forced into retreat. Delafontaine had the name she had been searching for and the evidence trail that connected it to 14 months of compromised witness protection. 3 moves completed. The board was arranging itself into the configuration she needed. One move remained, the one that would bring every thread together in a single coordinated action that left no room for the men who had betrayed her father's name and no room for the man who had sold a 16-year-old boy's safety for money. Outside the hospital window, the East River moved south toward the harbor. The Brooklyn Bridge was visible in the gray morning light, its cables disappearing into the low clouds. The repaired section of guardrail catching the pale sun the same way the sections around it did. 220 motorcycles were still parked along the bridge approach, their riders finishing the work, their presence holding the city's attention exactly where Marin needed it to be held. She opened her eyes. She picked up the phone. She had one more call to make. The 36 hours that followed did not move in a straight line. They moved the way water moves through a city after a storm, finding channels and gaps and underground passages that were not visible from the surface, emerging in unexpected places, converging in rooms that had been prepared for the convergence by people who understood that the surface story and the real story are almost never the same thing. Marin Caldwell discharged herself from Bellevue Hospital on a Friday morning against the explicit recommendation of her attending physician, a man named Hargrove, who had been practicing emergency medicine for 23 years and who told her with the dry bluntness of a doctor who has stopped believing in diplomacy that leaving with an immobilized leg and 11 stitches above her eye and a concussion that had not been fully evaluated was a decision he could not support and would document accordingly. Marin thanked him. She signed the discharge papers. She asked him if the documentation would include the fact that she had made the decision herself freely and with full understanding of the risks, and Hargrove said it would, and Marin said good, and that was the end of the conversation. She walked out of the hospital on a pair of aluminum crutches that the discharge nurse had fitted to her height, and the walk itself, 17 steps from the elevator to the lobby doors, was an exercise in the kind of controlled pain management that does not show on the face because the person experiencing it has decided that showing it is not an option available to her at this moment. The pain was there. It was significant. It occupied a channel of her awareness that demanded attention and received instead a calm, deliberate acknowledgement, followed by an equally calm, deliberate refusal to let it dictate the pace or the direction of what was about to happen. Gunnar was waiting outside with the car, not the motorcycle, not anything that carried the visual signature of the organization. A dark sedan, clean, unremarkable, driven by a man Marin did not recognize and did not ask about because the man's anonymity was the point. Boone Thatcher sat in the front passenger seat. He turned when Marin got in and looked at her with the expression of a man who had known her since she was 4 years old and had watched her take apart a carburetor at 9 and rebuild a transmission at 14, and was now watching her walk out of a hospital 48 hours after nearly dying on a bridge. And the expression on his face was not surprise because nothing this girl did surprised him anymore. It was something closer to confirmation. The confirmation of something he had suspected for years and was now seeing proved, which was that Marin Caldwell was exactly the person the world was going to need her to be. And she had arrived at that identity on her own schedule and by her own route. And nobody, not her father, not Boone, not the men who had tried to kill her on the bridge, had had any say in it. The drive to Newark took 47 minutes. Through the Holland Tunnel across the industrial flats of Jersey City, down the turnpike to the Ironbound District, the Portuguese neighborhood that had been Gunner's base of operations for 3 decades. The streets were quiet in the way the Ironbound is quiet on a Friday morning, not empty but unhurried. The neighborhood moving through its routines with the steady, unself-conscious rhythm of a place that has been itself for long enough to stop performing. The meeting happened in a private room above a restaurant on Ferry Street. Marin had been in this room before. She had eaten birthday dinners at the table below when she was a child, back when the room upstairs was just a storage space for extra chairs and the dry goods the kitchen bought in bulk. At some point during her childhood, the room had been converted into something else. The extra chairs had been replaced by a long table and 8 seats in a single overhead light that threw hard shadows across the walls and a heavy door with no handle on the outside. She had never asked when the conversion happened. She had never needed to. Children who grow up in worlds like hers develop an instinct for the rooms that exist behind the rooms everyone sees, and they learn without being taught that the questions you do not ask are sometimes more important than the ones you do. 4 people sat at the table, Marin at one end, Agent Delafontaine across from her, flanked by a representative from the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, a man in his 50s whose name was Everett Polk and whose function in the room was primarily legal rather than personal. He was there to witness, to authorize, to provide the institutional weight that made agreements binding and commitments enforceable. Gunner Caldwell sat beside his daughter, not at the head of the table, beside her. The positioning was deliberate, and everyone in the room understood what it communicated without anyone needing to explain it. Ezra sat in a chair against the wall. He had been brought to Newark by Boone in the early hours of the morning, driven through streets he did not know to a neighborhood he had never been to, and placed in a room above a restaurant that smelled of grilled sardines and strong coffee in the deep warmth of a building that had been heated by a kitchen for decades. He had slept for 3 hours on a cot that someone had set up near the back wall, and it was the deepest sleep he had experienced in 9 months. Not because the cot was comfortable, but because for the first time since Pittsburgh, someone else was standing watch. Marin opened the meeting. She did not defer to her father. She did not defer to the federal agent sitting across from her. She placed the USB drive on the table between them with the quiet precision of a person setting down a card that changes the game, and then she spoke for 11 minutes without interruption. She described the faction, not in generalities, not in the broad strokes of someone who had heard about it secondhand, but with the granular documented specificity of someone who had spent 3 months inside the investigation talking to the people who had been approached by the faction's recruiters, reviewing the financial documents that showed the money's path, mapping the connections between shell companies registered in 4 states, and the municipal contracts they had been awarded through a bidding process that was rigged so thoroughly it had become invisible to the oversight systems designed to catch exactly this kind of corruption. Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Maryland, 11 cities. Contracts worth a combined $47 million over 3 years, awarded to companies that existed as nothing more than filing addresses and bank accounts, the money flowing through them and emerging on the other side clean and untraceable, and funding an operation that wore her father's name without his knowledge or consent. She described the men involved. Not all of them. She had not been able to identify the entire network in 3 months, and she was honest about the limits of what she had found, which was itself a form of credibility that Delafontaine noticed and respected. Marin named 8 individuals who held positions within her father's organization across 3 chapters, men who had been recruited by the faction's leadership, and whose loyalty had been purchased through a combination of financial incentive and the implied threat that comes with knowing too much about an operation to safely leave it. Then she described the connection that brought everything together, the account that linked the shell companies to a federal employee. A deputy marshal in the Pittsburgh field office named Corbin Stroud, who had been receiving payments through a layered transfer system for 14 months, and who had been using his access to the witness protection infrastructure to sell the locations of federal witnesses to the subjects of the investigations those witnesses were meant to support. She said this while looking at Delafontaine, not at Polk, not at her father, at the woman who had spent 14 months trying to find exactly this connection and had been unable to because the connection was protected by the same institutional systems that were supposed to be protecting the witnesses. Delafontaine listened to all of it with the composed, attentive stillness of an investigator receiving confirmation of things she had suspected but could not prove. When Marin finished, Della did not compliment her or thank her or express the professional admiration that the moment might have warranted. She simply asked three precise questions about the financial transfer records on the USB drive, questions designed to establish the evidentiary chain of custody and the degree to which the documents could withstand the particular scrutiny of a federal courtroom. Marin answered all three. Then Della laid out the federal side of the case. She spoke for 8 minutes with the undecorated delivery of someone who had been carrying classified weight for a long time and was relieved to be setting some of it down in a room where it would be received by people who could do something with it. The prosecution that had been building for over a year out of the Western District of Pennsylvania. The federal contractor at the center of it, whose presence at the Strip District waterfront meeting was the structural foundation of the entire case. The 16-year-old eyewitness who could place that contractor at that location at that time, and whose testimony was the single element that transformed the case from circumstantial to provable. The witness protection arrangement that had been activated and then destroyed from the inside by a man who was being paid to destroy it. The mother who had been assaulted as a message. The boy who had been running for 9 months. Della looked at Ezra when she said this, not with pity. Ezra would not have accepted pity, and Della was perceptive enough to understand that. She looked at him with the direct, unsentimentalized acknowledgement of a person who understood exactly what had been done to him and was prepared to hold the people responsible, accountable for it, not as a favor, not as charity, but as the fundamental obligation of a system that had failed him and now had to make it right. The room was quiet when Della finished. The kind of quiet that fills a space when the full weight of a situation has been laid out and every person present is processing it through their own particular lens. Polk was processing it through the lens of legal consequence. Della through the lens of operational next steps. Ezra through the lens of hearing his own life described by strangers who knew more about it than he did. Gunnar Caldwell was processing it through a lens that nobody else in the room fully shared. The lens of a man who had built something over 31 years and was now hearing a detailed documented account of how that thing had been hollowed out from the inside by people he had trusted, people who had sat at his table and worn his patches and ridden beside him through situations that were supposed to forge the kind of bond that could not be broken by anything as ordinary as greed. The lens of a father who had watched his daughter nearly die because the corruption he did not know about had reached far enough to put her in the path of men willing to run a 17-year-old girl off a bridge to protect their investment. The lens of a man who was hearing all of this and containing his response to it within the walls of a discipline that had taken 51 years to build and was being tested at this moment more severely than it had ever been tested before. When he spoke, it was the first time he had spoken since the meeting began. His voice was level and measured, each word placed down with the deliberate care of a man who understood that words once spoken in a room like this became permanent and binding and could not be retrieved. He did not negotiate. He did not offer conditions. He did not do any of the transactional positioning that Polk had been quietly bracing for, the careful horse trading of concessions and guarantees that characterized every other meeting of this kind that Polk had participated in across 22 years of federal prosecution. Gunnar stated two things as facts and looked at Della while he stated them. The first was that he would provide her office with documentation. His organization had been accumulating for 8 months. Evidence against the corrupt faction and against Stroud's operation that federal investigators had not been able to obtain through their own channels. He was providing it not because it served him strategically, not because it bought him leniency or leverage or any of the currencies that men in his position typically traded in. He was providing it because the faction had operated under his name without his knowledge or consent, and that was a debt that existed independent of legality or consequence, a debt of honor. The kind that could only be paid in one way, by handing over everything he had and letting the system do what it should have been doing it all along. The second was that Ezra would receive real protection, properly structured, personally overseen by Della with direct accountability to the U.S. Attorney's Office. The kind that did not leak. The kind that was not accessible to the people who had already demonstrated what they did with access. The kind that a 16-year-old boy who had been failed by every institution responsible for his safety deserved and had not received and would receive now because the alternative was something Gunnar Caldwell refused to carry on his conscience alongside everything else. Then he did something that nobody in the room had anticipated. He asked about Lenora, Ezra's mother, still in Pittsburgh, still carrying the physical evidence of what Stroud's associates had communicated to her outside UPMD Presbyterian on a Wednesday evening 9 months ago. Gunnar asked about her recovery with the quiet specificity of a man who had already decided he was going to act on the answers before he heard them. He asked what hospital she was in. He asked about her care. He asked whether she had been contacted by anyone since the assault, whether the people who had delivered the message had returned, whether she was safe in the way that the word safe actually means, rather than the way institutions use it when they need a word that sounds like it covers a situation that it does not. Della told him the information was clinical and brief and contained within it the particular kind of institutional failure that sounds acceptable when described in the language of bureaucracy, but sounds like what it actually is when heard by a man whose daughter had nearly died on a bridge 2 nights ago, because the same institutional failure had allowed the same corruption to operate unchecked for over a year. Gunnar nodded once and said nothing further on the subject. But Boone made a phone call from the hallway outside the room 20 minutes later. The call lasted 4 minutes. And 3 days after that, Lenora Whitfield was transferred from the ward at UPMC Presbyterian, where she had been recovering with the minimal attention of an overextended medical system, to a private rehabilitation facility in a location that the U.S. Attorney's representative technically had no knowledge of and made no effort to acquire. Polk agreed to both of Gunnar's statements without counteroffer. Della agreed without hesitation. The USB drive moved across the table from Marin's side to Della's, and the transfer of it, that small physical act, the drive passing from one hand to another across 18 inches of wooden table in a room above a restaurant in Newark, was the hinge point on which the entire case turned. 3 months of Marin's investigation meeting, 14 months of Della's, the two halves of a map that had been carried by different people through different territories, finally laid side by side and recognized as parts of the same geography. The meeting lasted another 40 minutes after that. Details, logistics, the procedural machinery of a federal case being restructured around new evidence and new testimony, and a timeline that had accelerated beyond what anyone in the room had planned for 48 hours ago. Marin remained present for all of it. She asked questions when the details required clarification. She offered information when her 3 months of investigation contained answers that the federal side did not have. She operated in that room not as a 17-year-old girl who had been pulled from a bridge, but as a person whose preparation and intelligence and strategic clarity had earned her a seat at a table where the decisions that would determine the outcome of the case and the safety of the people involved were being made. Nobody in the room questioned her presence. Nobody suggested she wait outside or leave the operational details to the adults. The room had recognized what Boone had recognized in the car and what Della had recognized on the phone and what Gunnar had recognized the moment his daughter called him from a hospital bed and laid out a strategy that was better than anything his 31 years of experience would have produced. Marin Caldwell was the architect of what was happening in this room, and the room knew it. Deputy Marshal Corbin Stroud was arrested 4 days later at a budget motel in Weehawken, New Jersey at 6:20 in the morning. The motel was the kind of place that exists in every town adjacent to a major city, a low concrete building set back from the road with a parking lot that held more questions than vehicles and a neon sign that buzzed with the tired frequency of a business that has been operating at the margin of viability for longer than anyone involved cares to calculate. Stroud had been there for 2 nights. He had paid cash. He had registered under a name that was not his own, but was close enough to his own that the muscle memory of signing it had produced a signature that a handwriting analyst would later identify as belonging to the same hand, which was the kind of mistake that exhaustion produces and vigilance prevents, and Stroud had run out of vigilance somewhere on the New Jersey Turnpike 48 hours earlier. The arrest was conducted by 2 federal agents from the Newark field office, operating under a sealed warrant that had been signed by a federal judge at 11:15 the previous evening. There was no press conference, no cameras, no perp walk down a courthouse corridor for the evening news cycle, no theater of any kind. Two agents knocked on the door of room 114. Stroud opened it wearing a white undershirt, and the expression that law enforcement officers who have conducted hundreds of arrests learn to recognize instantly. That specific compound of resignation and relief that appears on the face of a person who has been running long enough to be exhausted by the running and who understands in the moment the knock comes that the exhaustion is about to end one way or another. His hands were at his sides. His eyes moved once to the badges and once to the warrant, and then returned to a middle distance that suggested he was already looking at something beyond the motel room, beyond the morning, beyond the immediate mechanics of what was happening at the long chain of decisions that had led him to this door, in this motel, in this town, in his undershirt at 6:20 on a Monday morning. He did not resist. He did not speak. He turned around when asked and placed his hands behind his back when asked and walked to the vehicle when asked with the compliant, mechanical gait of a man whose body was performing the required movements, while his mind was somewhere else entirely, already beginning the long internal accounting that would occupy him for years. The quietness of it was its own kind of verdict. No spectacle, no audience. Just a door opening and a man walking out of a room he had been hiding in and into a consequence he had been building for 14 months, in the morning continuing around him as though nothing of particular significance had occurred, which from the perspective of the motel and the street, in the ordinary Monday, it was nothing had. The significance was all interior, all structural, happening in the spaces between the visible events where the real architecture of accountability is built. Nadia Prescott published her story 4 hours after Stroud's arrest. Exclusive, comprehensive. 9 years of journalism had taught her that the best stories are not the ones you break first, but the ones you break right, and she had waited for this one with a discipline that cost her sleep and professional comfort, and the particular anxiety that comes with sitting on information, while the rest of the media runs a version of events that you know to be incomplete. The story detailed the corruption inside the marshal's office, the compromised witness protection arrangement, the connection to the broader fraud network operating across 4 states. She did not name Ezra. She had agreed to that condition without being asked because she understood that some names serve the public interest by being spoken and some serve it by remaining silent, and a journalist who cannot tell the difference between the two has no business holding the access that makes the distinction possible. The story ran on the front page of the station's digital platform and was picked up by national outlets within the hour. By noon, the narrative that had dominated the previous 48 hours, 220 bikers repairing a bridge in an act of loyalty, had acquired a second layer, a deeper architecture that connected the bridge repair to a federal corruption case and a compromised witness and a 17-year-old girl who had been conducting her own investigation, while the institutions responsible for conducting it had been infiltrated by the people it was supposed to target. Marin did not give interviews. She did not appear on camera. She did not participate in the grinding machinery of public attention that attached itself to the story and would continue to attach itself for weeks. She had accomplished what she set out to accomplish. Her father's name was clear. The faction was exposed. The man who had sold a boy's safety was in custody. The evidence was in the hands of people who could use it properly. What remained was personal. Marin met Ezra in a small family waiting room on the 3rd floor of Bellevue Hospital on a gray Wednesday morning. She had returned to the hospital not as a patient, but as a visitor walking in on crutches through the same lobby she had walked out of 3 days earlier against medical advice, and the nurse at the reception desk recognized her and said nothing, which was the correct response. The waiting room held 2 chairs, a window that faced east toward the river, and nothing else of consequence. The walls were the color of institutional calm, a shade of beige that existed in every hospital in every city and communicated nothing except the absence of any decision to communicate something specific. The window let in the gray morning light of a Brooklyn winter, and the light lay flat across the floor in a way that made the room feel like a space between spaces, a pause in the architecture of the building, a room that existed for the sole purpose of holding people who were waiting for something to change. Marin had asked for the room to be empty. She had asked for it to be just the two of them because what she needed to say and what she needed to ask required the particular kind of honesty that is only possible when there is no audience, no performance, no external expectation, shaping the interaction into something it is not. Ezra was already there when she arrived. He was sitting in the chair closest to the window with his backpack on the floor beside him, and the backpack looked the same as it had on the bridge, worn and compressed, and holding everything he owned with the patient resignation of an object that had been asked to do more than it was designed for and had done it without complaint. He stood up when she came in, not out of formality, out of the particular instinct that makes a person stand when someone they pulled from a bridge 2 days ago enters a room on crutches with stitches above her eye, and the direct, undiverted gaze of someone who has come to say something specific and will not leave until she has said it. Marin did not cry, Pima. She had not cried on the bridge. She had not cried in the hospital. She had not cried during the meeting in Newark or during the phone call with Delafontaine or during any of the moments in the previous 72 hours when the accumulated weight of what had happened might have licensed tears as a reasonable response. She did not cry now. She sat down. She looked at him with the clear, focused attention of someone who had been very close to not being in any room ever again and who understood what that proximity meant in a way that would never fully leave her. She did not use the language of gratitude. She did not say thank you, not because she was not grateful, but because the words felt structurally inadequate for what they were meant to carry, like trying to ship an ocean in an envelope. What he had done on that bridge existed in a category that the conventional vocabulary of thankfulness could not reach, and attempting to reach it with those words would have diminished both the act and the person who had performed it. Instead, she asked him a single question that had been forming inside her since the moment on the bridge when his arms had found hers and his body had become the counterweight between her life and the river. Why did you not keep walking? Ezra looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his backpack. The movement unhurried his hand, finding what it was looking for by touch, the way a person finds a familiar object in a dark room, and he pulled out the worn sketchbook with the rubber band around its spine. He opened it to a page near the middle and turned it toward her without a word. It was her face, drawn in pencil with the careful, practiced precision of someone who rendered human features from memory as both a discipline and a devotion. The proportions were exact. The line work was confident and clean, the kind of draftsmanship that comes not from training, but from thousands of hours of practice, face after face after face committed to paper, with the focused attention of a person for whom drawing was the primary means of holding on to a world that kept moving too fast to be held any other way. The drawing captured something that a photograph would have missed. Not just her features, but the quality of her expression, the particular way she held her jaw, the angle of her gaze, something in the architecture of her face that Ezra had seen once and remembered completely the way he remembered every face he drew as a permanent installation in the gallery of his memory. Marin looked at the sketch for a long time. She studied it the way a person studies a mirror that shows them not what they look like, but what they look like to someone else. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a reflection and a portrait, between the mechanical reproduction of features and the interpretive act of truly seeing another person. Then she looked at the date written in the lower corner. Small, exact handwriting. Ezra's handwriting. The numbers precise and unmistakable. The date was 4 months before the night on the bridge. The room held that information in silence. Neither of them attempted to fill the silence with words because there were no words structured correctly for what they were both sitting inside. He had drawn her face 4 months before she existed in his life as anything other than a stranger passing through his field of vision on a Brooklyn street, a face he had seen and remembered and committed to paper with the same care he gave to every face he drew. And 4 months later, on a bridge at 2 in the morning, the face in his sketchbook had become a bobby pin beneath a motorcycle above a 130-foot drop, and he had not kept walking because something in him, something below the level of conscious decision, had recognized what it was looking at. Not a stranger, something his hands had already held, something his memory had already claimed. A face he had already saved once on paper with a pencil and the focused attention of a boy who drew people because drawing them was the closest he could come to understanding them. Outside the window, the river was gray and flat and moving in the way that large bodies of water move, with a patience that makes human urgency look like a minor event. The Brooklyn Bridge was visible from the third floor if you stood close to the glass. Its cables caught the gray morning light. The repaired guardrail was indistinguishable from the sections around it. You could not tell from this distance that anything had happened there, that the metal had bent and a motorcycle had fallen and two lives had intersected above a frozen river in the middle of a February night. But Ezra knew, and Marin knew, and the knowing lived in the space between them in that small room with a quality that neither of them needed to name because naming it would have made it smaller than it was. Marin reached into the pocket of her jacket and placed a sealed envelope on the chair between them. She told Ezra it had been delivered to the shelter on Myrtle Avenue by Boone the previous evening. She told him it had been in her father's possession for 8 months, given to Gunnar by a man who had contacted him through channels that existed outside the normal infrastructure of the organization. She told him she did not know what was inside it, only that her father had said it belonged to Ezra and that the time had come for him to have it. She stood up. She adjusted her crutches. She looked at him one more time with the expression of a person who was leaving a room but not leaving the connection that the room contained, and then she walked out and closed the door behind her with a care that was its own kind of communication. Ezra sat alone with the envelope. He did not open it immediately. He sat with it on his lap and looked out the window at the river and the bridge and the gray sky above both, and listened to the particular silence of a hospital room that had just held two people and was now holding one. He opened it that evening, alone. In the first safe room he had occupied in 9 months, a properly secured location that Agent Delafontaine had arranged with the kind of institutional thoroughness that felt for the first time like something that might actually hold. A room with a lock on the door and a window that looked out onto a quiet street and a bed with clean sheets that smelled like laundry detergent rather than industrial cleaner. And the difference between this room and every room he had slept in for the past 9 months was so total that it took him several minutes of sitting on the edge of the bed before his body accepted that it was allowed to relax. Inside the envelope was a single photocopied letter, handwritten, dated 8 months ago, written in the weeks after Ezra had fled Pittsburgh, after Lenora had been assaulted, after the witness protection arrangement had collapsed, and a 16-year-old boy had disappeared into the geography of the eastern seaboard with nothing but a backpack and a broken compass. The letter was addressed to Gunnar Caldwell. It described a boy in Pittsburgh who had seen something he should not have seen. It described the danger the boy was in. It described the failure of the federal system to protect him, and the specific reason for that failure, a compromised deputy marshal selling witness locations described with enough detail to suggest that the letter's author had access to information that was not publicly available and not obtainable through ordinary means. The letter asked Gunnar to ensure the boy's safety, quietly, without federal involvement, because the federal system had already been compromised in ways the letter's author claimed to be able to document, and sending the boy back into that system was not protection, but delivery. Ezra read it twice. The handwriting was not familiar. He had never seen it before. The cadence of the sentences was not familiar either, though there was something in the rhythm of the language, a particular way of placing words that felt adjacent to recognition without arriving at it like hearing a melody through a wall and knowing you have heard it before but not being able to name the song. Then he turned to the signature at the bottom. The name written there for years was one he had never seen in handwriting before. He had seen it on a birth certificate once years ago when Lenora had needed the document for a school enrollment and had pulled it from the fireproof box she kept in the closet, and Ezra had read the name in the space marked Father and asked about it and received the same careful flat sentence he always received. He died before you were born. The name was his father's, a man Lenora had told him was dead. A man whose absence had been the defining architecture of Ezra's childhood, the empty space at the center of every family photograph that was never taken. Every school event where other children had two faces in the audience, and Ezra had one, every question he had learned to stop asking, because the asking produced a particular expression on his mother's face that he loved too much to cause deliberately. A man who had written a letter 8 months ago, who had known about the waterfront, who had known about Stroud, who had known about the collapse protection arrangement, who had known that his son was on the streets and in danger, and had reached through channels that existed outside every official system to place a request in the hands of a man whose organization had the reach and the loyalty and the operational capability to do what the federal government had failed to do. Ezra sat with that information in the quiet of the room, the letter in his hands. The broken compass in his backpack, the one that had not pointed north in 3 months, the only thing his mother had ever given him that she said belonged to his father. A compass that did not work, given by a man who was supposed to be dead, and the metaphor was so precise that it hurt in a way that was entirely new, different from the hunger and the cold and the fear that had defined the last 9 months, a pain that was not about absence but about presence, the sudden, overwhelming presence of a person he had been told did not exist. He did not cry. He had not cried when he left Pittsburgh. He had not cried on the streets. He had not cried on the bridge or in the shelter or in the car that brought him to Newark. He did not cry now. But something shifted in the interior architecture of who he was. A structural adjustment, a load-bearing wall moving to accommodate a weight it had not been designed to carry, and the adjustment was felt throughout the entire structure in the way he held the letter, in the way he breathed in, the way his eyes moved from the signature to the window and rested there on the view of a quiet street in a city that was not trying to kill him. He set the letter down on the bed beside him. He reached into his backpack and took out the compass and held it in his palm. The needle did not move. It pointed vaguely east, the same direction it had been pointing for 3 months, and it would probably never point north again because whatever mechanism inside it that had once found true bearing had been damaged beyond the compass's ability to repair. But the compass had not been given to him because it worked. It had been given to him because it had belonged to a man who was alive. A man who had been watching from a distance, too great to cross directly but close enough to act when acting became necessary. A man who had written a letter and placed it in the hands of a person who could do what he could not, and that letter had set in motion a chain of events that led to a bridge and a girl and 220 motorcycles and a room with a lock on the door and clean sheets and a window that looked out onto a street where nobody was hunting for anyone. Outside, the evening settled over the city with the gradual, unhurried authority of winter darkness arriving early. The streetlights came on. The quiet street held its quiet, and somewhere across the water, the Brooklyn Bridge carried its traffic and its pedestrians and its permanent patient weight with the indifference of a structure that has seen everything and holds the memory of none of it in its steel. The repaired guardrail caught the bridge lights the same way the sections around it did, indistinguishable, integrated, as though nothing had happened there, as though no motorcycle had hung over the edge and no girl had held on, and no boy had climbed the outside of the railing with empty hands and an empty stomach and pulled a stranger back from the longest fall of her life. But it had happened, and the evidence of it lived not in the metal but in the people, in a girl on crutches who had run the board from a hospital bed and cleared her father's name and dismantled a network that had taken root in the organization he had spent his life building, in an FBI agent who had finally found the name she had been searching for because a 17-year-old girl had found it first, in a journalist who had held a story because holding it was the braver act, in a man in Newark who had placed his hands on a bent guardrail and bowed his head and then given his men the only order that mattered, which was to build something instead of breaking it, and in a boy in a safe room holding a broken compass and a letter from a dead man who was not dead, sitting inside a silence that was not empty, but full of the particular kind of knowing that arrives when the story you have been told about your own life turns out to be incomplete, and the missing piece, when it finally appears, does not answer every question, but changes the shape of every question that remains. The East River moved south toward the harbor, the way it always had, carrying the reflections of the bridge lights on its surface, the way it carried everything temporarily patiently, without judgment or preference, until the current released them to the open water beyond. And somewhere between Newark and Providence, 220 motorcycles sat in garages and driveways, and the oil-stained parking spaces behind shops and houses, their engines cooling their riders home, their presence on the bridge that morning already becoming the thing it would remain for years, a story told and retold and remembered, not for the sound of 220 engines arriving, but for the silence that followed when they stopped, and for what was built in that silence by hands that the world had expected to destroy.